Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here talking to you all in my home state of California. My name is Britt Hermes. I am a PhD student in evolutionary genomics. Specifically, I study the skin microbiome, the teeny tiny microorganisms that live on all of us, and how these microorganisms might affect disease and health. This is the reinvented scientific version of me. But I'm not here today to talk about this research, but rather I'm here to talk about who I used to be. Meet Dr. Britt, naturopathic doctor. From 2011 to 2014, I was a licensed naturopath in the US. Thanks to funny legislation, I was a doctor licensed by the state of Washington and in Arizona. As a naturopath, I could bill insurance, I could write prescriptions. I called myself a primary care doctor. My elevator pitch went something like this. I combine nutrition and lifestyle advice with cutting-edge natural and pharmaceutical medicines to provide the most effective and affordable care. Naturopathic medicine is the solution to America's healthcare crisis. So yeah, I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I likely would have gone the entirety of my career as a naturopath if I hadn't unexpectedly found myself in a nerve-rattling situation that led to me leaving naturopathy, becoming a naturopathic whistleblower and the most hated naturopath in the world. I will tell you that story. First, though, I want to tell you what naturopathy is and how I got there. Naturopathy is essentially based on magic. Its origins trace back to late 19th century beliefs in vitalism. In this sense, all living beings embody a sort of supernatural energy force that is responsible for making you healthy or sick. The point of naturopathy is to manipulate this energy with natural stuff like water, plants, sunshine, and just generally through interacting with nature. Other traditional systems of medicine have similar concepts. It's called Qi in Chinese medicine. Ayurveda calls it prana. I came to naturopathy when I was 16 years old because I was diagnosed with psoriasis. I remember crying in the exam room with the doctor. He said I would have this disease for the rest of my life and that steroids were my only treatment option. There were no alternatives. Instead of accepting his prognosis, I got sucked into the world of natural medicines. I took tons of supplements, started eating clean. My psoriasis got better, and I was certain that these natural therapies were what cured me. I had conveniently forgot that I used steroid creams and prescription shampoos. I found out later that a tonsillectomy I had when I was 21 maybe also helped to clear up my psoriasis. I used this psoriasis story in my application to naturopathic programs. In my personal statement, I wrote, in naturopathic medicine, the oath to do no harm is more significant and prevalent than in any other field. Medical physicians lack training to find the root cause of disease. Their treatments suppress the symptoms of a greater underlying issue, which causes the patient to get sicker over time. This suppression is the worst harm a doctor can impose on a patient. In 2007, I started naturopathic school at Bastyr University in Seattle, which describes itself as offering degrees in science-based natural medicine and as a leader in cutting-edge research in complementary and alternative medicine. I thought I was going to medical school. Naturopathic students are consistently being told that they are engaged in a rigorous curriculum and comprehensive clinical training and groundbreaking research. In reality, naturopathic schools peddle pseudoscience. Naturopathic schools are unique in that they teach naturopathy plus just enough medicine to make it all seem legitimate to the unsuspecting. For example, we had a gross anatomy lab. I dissected cadavers. I took a physiology class, a histology lab, and a biochemistry course, among many other classes with medical titles. But BS outweighed whatever real science was taught in the program. Naturopathy is seemingly composed entirely of any type of alternative medicine you can imagine. A favorite magical treatment among MDs is homeopathy. This is a debunked therapy from the 18th century, whereby patients are given extreme dilutions of all kinds of stuff, like herbs or metals or poisons, or even weird things like pieces of the Berlin Wall. And it's these things that supposedly cause the symptoms of the disease being treated. Homeopathic remedies are super dilute. They're so diluted that none of the original substance remains in the product. It is the so-called memory or essence of that original stuff, of that remedy, that is believed to treat the disease. Naturopaths don't see homeopathy as nonsensical. In fact, I was required to take 3 times as many classes in homeopathy than pharmacology. I was also required to learn about traditional Chinese medicine, energy healing, hydrotherapy, and I was consistently exposed to all kinds of magical thinking, like medical astrology, on numerous occasions. For example, this 2013 class called Plants and Planets, an Astrological System of Medicine, was taught by the director of research laboratories at Bastyr, who describes himself as an always learning herbalist and laboring alchemist. But even outside of these woo-woo courses, integrated into almost every so-called real medical class I took were worrisome examples of pseudoscience. Here is a snippet from my pediatrics course that taught us to use homeopathic remedies for acute medical problems. We were taught to use belladonna, for example, for treating febrile seizures. Belladonna, which is also known as deadly nightshade, is a poisonous plant. In 2017, homeopathic teething products contaminated with dangerously high levels of belladonna caused deaths in children. Homeopathy is not real, but naturopaths love it. It gets worse. We were also taught naturopaths could treat mental illness. Here are some of my notes for treating schizophrenia. I was taught, for example, that food allergies might cause hallucinations or delusions, and that heavy metals, referring to testing patients for heavy metal toxicity, could also cause symptoms of schizophrenia. There's no reason to think that heavy metals cause schizophrenia, or that even the average person has been exposed to them. But remember, I believed I had cured my own psoriasis with supplements and diet changes. So when I'm taking down these notes, I'm not thinking this is weird or this is crazy. I'm thinking medical doctors are so stupid. I bet they don't even test schizophrenic patients for food allergies or heavy metals. I think you get the picture. Naturopaths take some classes with the same names as medical school courses, but the content that we learn is alternative medicine. And this is what all of the naturopathic students are into. They all think we are the future of medicine. This is a screenshot from the American Association of Naturopathic Medical Colleges, describing exactly that. And naturopaths are motivated and organized enough that there are even international trips to get medical experience treating patients in developing countries. After my second year at Bastyr, I went on one of these trips to Ghana. Before the trip, I had only taken a weekend course, 2 days, a weekend course on giving intravenous injections. But with only that experience and with no supervision, I was allowed to give IVs on very sick patients, some severely dehydrated children and others with unknown infections. We were not allowed to diagnose, but we treated patients anyway. Looking back, this is absolutely horrifying. Today, naturopathy has been rebranded as naturopathic medicine. Naturopaths call themselves naturopathic doctors, or NDs for short, and the profession has been somewhat successful as passing itself off as a credible medical specialty that claims to blend both the best of modern and traditional medicines. And to get here, naturopaths have aggressively and relentlessly lobbied for laws that allow them to be licensed. I participated in this licensing effort. In my last year at Bastyr, I attended an annual lobbying event called DC Fly. Naturopaths across the US gather in Washington, DC to lobby for recognition as a legitimate medical profession. And under the direction of leaders in the field, I helped to disseminate inaccurate and misleading information about naturopaths. I looked into the eyes of lawmakers on Capitol Hill and said things like, naturopathic doctors are masters of prevention. They maintain and restore your health. We take the same courses as medical students and are trained as primary care doctors. Without legislation, we cannot grow to offer our medicine to the wider population. This campaign of misinformation has been pretty successful. About half of the US states license or regulate naturopaths. In California, naturopaths can call themselves doctors. They can perform physical exams, including gynecological exams, and order lab tests like imaging and x-rays. They can diagnose patients, prescribe some drugs like hormones, and give intravenous therapies and other injections. But contrary to what naturopaths will tell you, regulating the naturopathic profession does not make the practice of naturopathy safe. I think it's telling, for example, that at the very top of the page for the scope of practice page on the California Naturopathic Doctors Association, there is this giant advertisement for legal services for naturopaths. But let me give you a personal example. In 2014, my former boss was importing a dubious cancer drug called Ukraine and giving it to cancer patients. Ukraine has been marketed as a cancer cure-all, and it was being used in my practice to treat all kinds of cancers. Ukraine is not FDA approved, and thus importing and administering it is potentially illegal. Plus, Ukraine is associated with some really serious side effects, like liver failure and bone marrow toxicity. Once I discovered this information, I quit my job. I reported my boss to the Attorney General and to the Naturopathic Regulatory Board. After what I would call a very superficial investigation, the board delivered my former boss a letter of reprimand. This is basically just a slap on the wrist. The board even twisted the truth and said that my boss had voluntarily stopped using the drug. But the truth is, and my former boss even admitted this to me in private, was that the drug had stopped arriving overseas from Austria. It was around this time that the manufacturer, this guy, had been arrested in Vienna on fraud charges for relabeling and selling expired product. Based on the timing of events, our patients could have received some of this expired product. And I still feel sick about all of this. It was after this experience that I decided to leave the profession of naturopathy. It had become glaringly obvious to me that naturopaths are not trained in the rigors of science, medicine, or ethics. They believe homeopathy is real. They think natural is always better. And perhaps most concerning, naturopaths genuinely believe that they are just like medical doctors. Perhaps, in part, because the naturopathic professional bodies keep insisting that this is true. Here on the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians website, they state, naturopathic doctors receive training in the same biomedical and diagnostic sciences as MDs and DOs, resulting in a scientific medical education comparable to that of MDs. This is wholly untrue. Naturopaths are brainwashed with this propaganda. They need to believe it in order to sell it to lawmakers. This makes naturopaths remarkably bad at providing transparency about their training and education and adhering to safe practices. Take vaccines, for example. Naturopaths love to claim that they are not anti-vax, which is surprising given what we are taught in naturopathic school. My pediatrics class was riddled with anti-vaccine thinking. We read the Bob Sears Alternative Vaccine book, which outlines delayed and limited vaccine schedules. And there's more. Naturopaths are taught that there are reasonable and safe alternatives to vaccines for gaining immunity against infectious diseases. My recommended reading list from my PEDS course at Bastyr also included homeopathy books and a book that even claims in the title that foods create super immunity for kids, whatever that is. And we were taught to doubt the scientific consensus, the health authorities, and vaccine research. The idea that vaccines are not safe, and therefore it's fine to use some sort of natural alternative to gain immunity against an infectious disease is pervasive in the naturopathic profession. Let me demonstrate exactly what I mean. The Bastyr Clinic for Natural Health where I completed my so-called clinical training during my naturopathic education at Bastyr University, sells homeopathic vaccines. Here, you can see the MMR homeopathic vaccine listed on their online dispensary. This is called homeoprophylaxis. And this is the bogus idea that a patient can achieve immunity against a disease using homeopathy instead of a real vaccine. Given all of this woo, I was not particularly surprised when I heard that a California naturopath was recently caught issuing fake COVID-19 vaccine cards and selling homeoprophylaxis pills for COVID-19. You all probably heard about this. It was all over the news. In July 2020, Julie Mazie, a naturopath in Napa, was federally charged for falsifying COVID-19 vaccination cards, selling fake homeopathic COVID-19 vaccine pellets, and spreading false COVID vaccine information. Stephanie Hines, a lawyer for the Department of Justice's Northern District of California, said of Mazie and the case, "Instead of disseminating valid remedies and information, Julie Mazie profited from unlawfully peddling unapproved remedies, stirring up false fears, and generating fake proof of vaccinations." I could not have said it better myself. The news reported that she earned over $200,000 from her scheme between January 2020 and May 2021. Mazie has since been charged with 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of false statements related to healthcare matters. When the naturopathic profession caught wind of this story, they moved quickly to separate themselves from Mazie. This kind of story is bad press for California naturopaths, especially now as the profession is seeking an expanded scope of practice. The president of the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians put out a statement the same day the news story hit, stating, "While this practitioner's alleged actions are extremely disheartening, they in no way reflect the profession of naturopathic medicine, its mission, and the actions of our physician members. NDs have been leaders in their communities and have played a crucial role in the prevention of COVID-19 and support of patients suffering with this illness. We continue to emphasize the importance of licensing and regulation of naturopathic medicine." But have naturopaths really played a crucial role in the prevention of COVID-19 and support of patients suffering from it? The AANP statement on the COVID-19 vaccine uses very carefully crafted language that basically says naturopaths should be allowed to administer the vaccine, but they don't actually endorse the vaccine for COVID prevention. Let me show you. Here's the opening paragraph of their statement on the COVID vaccine. I'll just read it so we can all follow along together. "With broader eligibility and availability of the vaccine and increased distribution channels, the AANP strongly advocates the naturopathic physicians to have access to and be able to administer the COVID-19 vaccine where it is within their scope of practice. Fundamental to AANP's strategic plan is to advocate for NDs to be licensed and recognized to practice to the fullest extent of their education and training throughout the US. Naturopathic physicians are educated on the standards of care for immunization, and vaccines are one of the many tools used by naturopathic physicians to protect against infectious diseases as reflected in the American of Accredited Naturopathic Medical College's core competencies on immunization education." When I read that, I don't see an explicit endorsement of the vaccine anywhere in this statement. The AANP then goes on to say how there are still many unknowns with the COVID vaccine, and therefore naturopaths should be licensed in all 50 states so that naturopaths can legally sell their woo-woo to patients. I'll read to you just one more time. In summary, licensed naturopathic physicians play a valuable role as frontline primary healthcare providers, but are limited by lack of licensure in all 50 states. Their patient-centered communication, comprehensive training and prevention-oriented primary care, and unique expertise in evidence-based integrative and natural health provides effective treatment of chronic diseases and supports immune health in a manner that may be able to lessen the burden of COVID-19 morbidity. I don't believe there is any real evidence to back up that statement. But there is evidence showing that naturopaths are profiting off of selling fake COVID treatments. Of course, Julie Mazie is a great example of this. There are more. In June 2020, the US Federal Trade Commission issued dozens of warnings to companies making dubious claims about treating the novel coronavirus. Of course, many of these warnings were sent to naturopaths, offering homeopathic injections to prevent infection, supplements to boost immune function, and high doses of vitamin C injected directly into the veins. Intravenous injections of high doses of vitamin C has become a favorite treatment for naturopaths during this pandemic. In October 2020, the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians put out a statement recommending that physicians and hospitals give intravenous vitamin C to, quote, combat the COVID pandemic. In their statement, the association writes that recent data from China demonstrated that intravenous vitamin C was an effective adjunct therapy, and that patients receiving intravenous vitamin C, quote, experienced shorter hospital stays and lower mortality. So, of course, I went and looked up the original publication in the Chinese Journal of Infectious Diseases. This study is, in fact, not a study. The paper is recommended clinical guidelines for treating the novel coronavirus. I could not find any original data to support the vitamin C recommendations. I have absolutely no idea where the Naturopathic Association found this data, if there is any, suggesting that vitamin C could shorten hospitalizations or reduce death. I think it is also worth noting that the authors of the clinical guidelines also recommended using traditional Chinese therapies to reduce wind. Leading up to this talk, I did a Google search to look for California naturopaths offering their therapies to help treat or prevent COVID-19. I didn't find much, which was a bit surprising until I found this. In response to the numerous FTC warnings, the California Naturopathic Doctors Association put out this statement. The CNDA has conducted an analysis of recent FTC citation letters and is recommending that practices limit the use of the terms COVID and coronavirus to discussions around clinic hours and safety only, and not at all when discussing supplements or treatments. While this may seem harsh, for the protection of the naturopathic community and your own practices, we encourage you to heed these cautionary recommendations. In other words, don't discuss COVID in the context of treatments or supplements in order to protect yourself and your profits, not the patient. In my opinion, this is just another example of the naturopathic profession placing the advancement of the profession over the well-being of patients. Here's another example from a few years ago now. In March 2017, a 30-year-old woman named Jade Eric went to a licensed naturopath in San Diego. Jade had eczema, an itchy and unsightly but otherwise benign skin condition. Kim Kelly, a naturopath, recommended that Jade get an intravenous injection of curcumin, which is present in the commonly used Indian spice turmeric. The spice itself, and specifically curcumin, are widely believed by naturopaths to be a cure-all with anti-inflammatory, antiviral, anti-tumor, and basically anti-anything bad properties. Curcumin is also thought by many naturopaths and integrative medicine doctors to be incredibly safe and to not have any side effects. Here's a blog post by Kim Kelly highlighting the many wonders of curcumin. He says it is good for arthritis, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, and that it's been used for thousands of years for medical reasons. Kelly mixed up an IV of liquid curcumin made by a local compounding pharmacy named Impress Pharmaceuticals. Within minutes, or perhaps within just 1 minute, we aren't exactly sure, Jade had a terrible reaction to her IV. Kelly assumed it was an allergic reaction. He administered an EpiPen and then called 911. And then either on the way to the hospital or just before, Jade slipped into a coma. About a day later, she was pronounced dead. There are a few important points to know about this case. First, it turns out that Jade wasn't issued a prescription for the curcumin. According to FDA rules, compounding pharmacies require a prescription in the patient's name. But Impress said in a statement that it had no record of a prescription for Jade. I wasn't surprised to learn this. It is common practice in the naturopathic community to order medications in bulk under one patient's name, and then to give this product to multiple patients. I know many former colleagues who did exactly this. Second, it was later determined by the FDA that the curcumin product was made with a type of castor oil that is not suitable for medical use because it may contain allergens or contaminants. To me, both Kelly and Empress are at fault. This perhaps helped Kelly. I suspect the California Naturopathic Board pounced on any reason to take the heat off of one of their own. Even though Kelly seems to have committed prescription fraud, he might have been able to build a defense on the point that Empress made the curcumin with contaminated castor oil. When I checked last week, Kelly's California license was still in good standing, and his practice website indicates business as usual. He is still allowed to administer intravenous injections to patients, and he charges $300 for a first-time office visit. Around the time of this Kim Kelly case, I looked into how the California Naturopathic Board works, and I found something very troubling. California naturopathic regulators appear to be dragging their feet in investigating complaints. Here at the bottom, you can see the massive difference in complaint processing times among various health professions. It turns out that Kelly had been named in the complaint for using ozone therapy nearly 12 months before he had treated Jade for eczema. He had been advertising ozone injections in joints, and I kid you not, had been blowing ozone gas into the rectums and vaginas of patients. Had Kelly been investigated in a timely manner, perhaps Jade may still be alive today. It truly seems that naturopathic regulatory boards function to protect naturopaths and not patients. The terrifying aspect of all of this for me is that it appears as though the naturopathic profession is willing to use the pandemic to push an agenda to integrate unproven and potentially harmful naturopathic therapies into medical care. More than ever, the naturopathic community has a responsibility to ensure the safety of patients. Instead, I see a profession trying to capitalize on fear and on the pandemic. We need comprehensive reform of the naturopathic profession, which would have to include stripping them of doctor and physician titles, banning them from treating children, and perhaps phasing out licensing so patients stop viewing them as medical professionals. We should not rely on naturopaths to regulate themselves. One problem is that the public believes that naturopaths are vetted medical providers. Naturopaths have many markers of legitimacy, accreditation, licensing exams, and well-funded organizations. But naturopaths also have their nonsense at the forefront, and they hate that I frequently point this out to them in my writings and talks. They've been trying to stop me from speaking at events like this for a long time now. In 2016, for example, naturopaths started a change.org petition accusing me of defamation against the profession, calling me bitter and unsuccessful. It seems that the naturopathic profession measures success by the amount of quackery you are willing to sell to patients. By this standard, I am very happy to say that I am the most unsuccessful naturopath on the planet. In 2017, I was sued in Germany by an American naturopath for allegations of defamation. This is a long and complicated story. The background, legal arguments, and outcome are all covered in detail on my blog. Long story short, we won. The lawsuit was bogus, and the court ruled my statements were protected speech under the German Constitution. It is important for me to thank Iran Segev from Australian Skeptics, who spearheaded a massive fundraiser to defend myself. And thank you to everyone who donated and sent me messages of support and love. I know that naturopaths were hoping this lawsuit would shut me down. Instead, it sparked the Streisand effect. There was global media coverage about the lawsuit, and I think naturopaths ended up getting way more negative press than they bargained for. I was honored with the prestigious John Maddox Award in 2018 for my work exposing naturopathy after this lawsuit was filed. It is clear to me that naturopaths do not want me writing or speaking about my experiences in the profession, but I will continue to stand up for science and to tell you all to trust me. I am not a doctor. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Britt. Joining us from Germany right now for a little discussion is Britt Hermes. Whenever you talk, I have to shake my head a lot. It's such a crazy story of what you've been through. Which brings me to my first question. Why do you hate nature?
Why do I hate nature?
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. That's just a joke. But for me, homeopathy is kind of my litmus test to test people's skepticism. If I can get people to believe in homeopathy, I can get them to believe in anything.
Sure.
Do you have specific litmus tests for what you think is a test of skepticism?
Like when I hear messaging or I hear propaganda that sort of like makes the alarm bells ring, you mean?
Yeah.
So anytime I hear someone talk about how we can boost the immune system, my alarm bells immediately start going off, because I know that they're just repeating catchy phrases that don't actually mean anything. And if you take a step back and think about what does that actually mean, and do I want my immune system to be boosted? Is that actually a good thing, or is that going to lead to autoimmune activity of my body attacking itself? So that's an immediate sort of phrase for me that makes my spidey senses go off. There's a ton of homeopathy prevalent in naturopathy in every medical field that I've that I've experienced here, from dentistry to pediatrics. We're constantly being offered homeopathy. So that also, of course, is a big red flag. And then whenever I hear people talk about how big pharma, is out to get us, and how we're not necessarily getting the full truth and nothing but the truth, that always makes me a little bit concerned, and sort of my eyebrows go up, because of course there's big supplements too. And, big supplements does as many bad things, or perhaps more, depending on where you're setting the bar.
And also multi-billion-dollar business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you spent a lot of time talking about this myth of the validity of regulation. What do you think we can do about that? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, this is really tricky, because the idea that a profession self-regulates is not a new one. I mean, I think almost all health professions, in a sense, self-regulate. Yep. I don't want to say that like with absolute truth across the board, but I think it's super common that health professions self-regulate. And so the idea that, if you're setting up a naturopathic regulatory board, for example, I think this makes sense to a lot of people who are, involved in sort of this type of legislation. I think what we have to advocate for is having outside experts on these regulatory panels, no matter what. And we have to have clear ideas of what is a standard of care and what deviates from the standard of care. I think where things get really tricky with naturopathy is that there literally are no standards of care. So in Arizona, where I practiced, for example, the standard of care was defined by one or more naturopath in that state doing that thing.
Oh.
So if you were to bring a complaint or issue a complaint against a naturopath for doing something totally wacky, if that naturopath could demonstrate that someone else in that state is also doing that wacky thing for that same condition, then they've established a standard of care. And now that regulatory board sort of has their hands tied, where they can't really effectively investigate or provide any real consequences.
So much of what you talk about just makes me fear for society. Do you think that the COVID pandemic has been a goldmine for naturopaths, or do you think that it's minimized them? What do you think the effect's been for naturopaths?
Yeah, so it's a little bit hard for me to speak to this directly without being in the
Yeah,
States during the pandemic and sort of witnessing this up close and personal. But I think Julie Maisie, this naturopath from Napa, is a really good example where she made hundreds of thousands of dollars in a really short time, capitalizing on people's fears. And I know that since I started speaking out, naturopaths have moved their advertisements and their marketing and what they're putting out about what naturopathy can do for the patient to private platforms. So private Facebook pages, for example, and sort of these places of the internet that I can't easily access as me.
right, right,
And so they're speaking to people who already believe in naturopathy. They're talking to people who are already afraid of vaccines for whatever reason, who already believe in whatever, using high dose vitamin C or homeopathic pills. And so I think with all of the fear and the uncertainty and the stress, which I mean has been massive no matter where you're living in the country, especially if you have kids, right? And just not knowing like all of this fear about sending kids to school and how do you balance the needs of education and socialization, blah, blah,
right.
blah. I think it's really easy for anyone to turn to a naturopath and to buy whatever it is they're selling. I mean, this is what sort of fuels alternative medicine in general, is fear.
Right.
And we've had this perfect firestorm of fear these last, God, however million years it's been with COVID.
So I'm going to bring in some questions from the web now. Jason Bush asks, is there any particular care that can be taken with homeopathy proponents in particular to say that's just the placebo effect without being insulting?
Yeah,
How do
this
we
is
bring those
tricky.
people over?
Yeah, this is a tricky question because it gets to the role of medical ethics and practicing medicine. So there was a situation in Arizona where a woman came in who believed that she had a fake disease called multiple chemical sensitivity. And so because everything literally made her sick, she was afraid to take antibiotics. She was afraid to have vaccines. But the problem is that she had been bitten by a dog, and the dog bite was really deep. And she couldn't remember the last time that she had had a tetanus vaccine. And the standard of care for medical doctors in that scenario is, clean the wound, irrigate, antibiotics, oral antibiotics, and make sure that patient is up to date on the tetanus vaccine. So there was a lot of negotiating in this situation because I was the person who was taking care of her, and she lived far, far, far out of town by herself. So my fear was she would drive hours out of the city, something would happen, and she wouldn't be able to quickly or easily get help. And if tetanus set in, she would be very sick, and this would be a problem. So we negotiated antibiotics with topical antibiotics, and I sent her home with a written prescription that she could fulfill, which I'm sure there's questions about what prescriptions naturopaths can write. We'll get to that. We can get to that next. But then I had to somehow figure out how to get her to willingly take this vaccine or get this vaccine. And so I decided that I would offer her a homeopathic remedy that is used in the natural alternative medicine world to combat vaccine side effects. And so I sold it as this. I said, this is, and I knew this vaccine because this is how we administer, or this remedy, excuse me, because this is how we did it when I worked in a pediatric office. I said, I'll give you the vaccine, and then I'll give you this homeopathic remedy. You can take it as needed. It'll clear your body of toxins, whatever buzzwords, I needed to say at that moment. And I have to say that I didn't really believe so much in homeopathy, but I knew it was an effective tool in this case. And so I made the choice to essentially lie to the patient in order to get her to get this care that I thought was critical. Now, this is not ethical. This is not an ethical practice of medicine, but I was faced with this choice of trying to get her to do something that I thought was really, really important. Now, do I think that medical doctors or, vaccine advocates should go about selling bundles of vaccines with homeopathic pills to clear the effects of the toxins in vaccines or whatever BS they think is going. Of course not. That is totally not okay. But that's all to say that these are the types of sort of ethical dilemmas that you can be faced with in this situation. And so I don't know that it's really a matter of insulting the patient. It's a matter of willfully, I think, lying to the patient. Because even if you tell the patient, oh, this will help you feel better, but it's placebo, you're still planting this idea that this thing is going to have an effect and will help them feel better or not get sick or get over the sickness faster. And I think that actually complicates it. And it muddies the placebo effect in a sense, because you as a person in power are telling them that it's going to work for them.
So now for a medical professional to give that kind of advice, I understand it. Do you have any advice for those of us that aren't medical professionals that have to deal with people that are friends and family who are going to forego real medicine for those kinds of treatments?
Yeah, well, this is tricky. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of having these types of conversations, because these can be really inflammatory and emotional conversations.
Oh yeah.
So of course, yeah, right. So of course, like the answer is it depends, right? Which isn't a very useful answer, but I mean it with sincerity. You know, it depends on the timing and the place. So you need to pick a situation and a time that isn't going to add to the emotional nature of the conversation. And I think, and you know, this can be explored in further detail, but I think you have to pick your battles in a sense. You know, if they're foregoing medical care for cancer, well, that's a battle worth having, right? But if they're foregoing medical care because they stubbed their toe, or they have a bad bruise, or something is self-limiting, and it's not a high-risk patient.
Right.
And even though there is harm in those situations, absolutely, there's a potential of harm, but you have to sort of be able to step back and say, well, how big is that risk of harm? And is this worth having this conversation at this moment? Alternatively, what you can do, and sort of the strategy that I've taken with a lot of my friends and families, is to add in pieces of these information outside of like a high stress incident, like this person is sick and they have to make a decision now, but rather we're just like having coffee or sitting around and talking. And then something happens, like a patient dies from getting treated for eczema, which is a totally benign condition in a sense, you know, it won't kill you. And that's a good time to share these types of stories, like, hey, did you know that this poor woman just had itchy skin? She had eczema, and this naturopath did this crazy thing and it killed her. And this is why we have to be careful about who we see and who we trust, you know, as a doctor, and what type of medical care that we're exploring. I think it's better to sort of drop information that way.
I think also, like any skeptical topic, if you ask people a lot of questions, you'll find out interesting things about their fundamental beliefs and what's really underneath it. I once had to ask an acquaintance why they believed in homeopathy, and peeled the onion and got to the stage where he just believed that the intention of the person making the medicine mattered.
Sure.
And I had no idea that was a thing. But as soon as I understood that we were never going to agree on that. So,
yeah.
All right. We have another question from Gail Knapp. Can you tell us how you've been received by the mainstream medical community since you've been so public about your history?
By the mainstream medical community, I think I've been fairly well received. I was honored with this amazing award called the John Maddox Award, which recognized the experience and the emotional toll of coming out and telling my story and doing it in such a public way, and the backlash that occurred after this. I've frequently am used by medical providers as a resource for their patients. You know, oh, you're thinking about doing this thing, because it gives them a way to say, oh, I don't know so much about that, but you should check out this blog, or talk to this patient, or follow her, or not patient, talk to this ex-naturopath and follow her on Twitter. So it allows them to sort of take the heat off of themselves and not deliver the news that naturopathy is bunk. It allows me to do that, and I'm happy to do that for the medical providers in that situation, because it's not my relationship with that patient that matters, but rather it's the relationship between that doctor and that patient that needs to be maintained, and that trust that needs to stay intact. And so I think overall it's been sort of an amazing experience from scientists and skeptics and from the medical community. And I've been really lucky to be received with such kindness and such open arms.
Fantastic. Deborah from Monterey Skeptics asks, do you have any thoughts on why people turn to alternative medicine in the first place?
Yeah. So again, the best answer here is it depends, which of course is not very informative, but there's a whole host of reasons. The most common, I think, is my story, where you have a bad experience with a doctor in light of a diagnosis that is very distressing because it's chronic, because it's terminal, because it's expensive, perhaps. So something that, is really distressing and really stressful. And so people are seeking medical care. They usually don't like the answers that they receive, or perhaps like me, they just think their doctor's kind of an a-hole and they don't want to go back there. This is really, really common with women because it's super common that women get treated really poorly in these types of medical visits where their symptoms are not really believed or believed to be as bad as that woman is describing, or minimized in a way that feels really patronizing. On the other hand, it's very typical for patients to go to naturopaths and to feel heard for the first time. And patients will describe the naturopath as a warm, caring person who listens. And that's not a typical experience that you get with a medical doctor. Usually, I think there's a huge generational thing here where things are changing over. But I think it's pretty common that people just feel like they were treated poorly and they want something different.
Very good. All right. We have a serious medical question here. Okay. I'm curious, what ailment is diluted Berlin Wall meant to treat?
Yeah. So what I was learned it was used to treat for was separation anxiety.
Seems obvious to me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So feeling alone, feeling like not getting the support that you needed or that you need, feeling trapped.
Vincent Jorgensen asks, that you know of, has your naturopathy apostasy led to any more defections?
Yes. None that I can say publicly because people come out and tell me these stories in confidence, but many. Yeah.
Wow. All right. Jeannie Scott asks, why isn't there more pushback from legitimate medical associations against licensing and other forms of acceptance of naturopathy?
What a good question. I don't know. I think I would have to talk with lobbyists and maybe people involved in these professional bodies. I can speculate, though. I think so naturopathy is a relatively small profession, so naturopaths are probably not viewed as a huge threat. There's probably not much of a feeling like naturopaths are impinging on anyone's turf, so to speak. There probably is not much of a feeling that naturopaths are going to take business away from medical doctors because there's so few in comparison. One strategy that naturopaths use when trying to get legislation passed is to just get something really small, really simple, something that feels like a no big deal thing passed through legislation. And then, of course, they use that as like a way just to get their foot in the door. And then they come back every year to amend that bill, amend that bill, amend that bill, and increase the scope of practice very incrementally. So it's not the case that naturopaths are going to get licensure plus this massive scope of practice where they can, write prescriptions and see patients independently and administer IVs and order x-rays and yada, yada, yada. They'll start with one thing like, we just want to protect the title of naturopathic doctor. That's no big deal, right? We just want to, you go to the school and then only these people can use that title. And so I think when these bills are coming through, it seems like such a no big deal bill that it's perhaps not worth the time and the financial resources to spend fighting it.
We have time for a couple more questions. This is from Vincent again, who lives in California. What can I do to hold my state accountable?
Yeah, this is another good question. And we sort of get to this issue of the self-regulation problem. And of course, my example where I felt like I was filing a complaint with the regulatory board for like what I thought was the worst thing ever, and basically nothing happened. So, but I will say this. So, Julie Mazie got in trouble because someone issued a complaint. So when it is egregious enough, action must be taken. Now, there is a small like snippet in the California bylaws when you go to the California Medicine Committee webpage, where they say that if enough complaints are issued and there looks like there's a pattern of malpractice or a pattern of sort of bad things happening, that they have to take note of that. And so I think that's also important. I think it's important because there are records of how many complaints are processed, not necessarily the details of the complaints, but you know, that chart where I showed the lag time of the complaint processing times, you know, I was able to put that together because there is a record of the number of complaints. And so I think this type of data in the long run is really important, because when you have data like this, you can then show to lawmakers, well, like, look how many complaints, for example, are being filed against naturopaths. Like, the public actually isn't that happy because it looks like a disproportionate number, for example, given how many are actually licensed in the state. And so maybe it feels like you're not doing much, but I think in the long run, this type of information and just following through when you see something that's wrong or concerning is really important.
Great. Let's do one more question. This is from one of our other speakers, Thomas Westbrook from Holy Kool-Aid. He asks, you mentioned chi and prana. How much is religion and superstition integrated into naturopathy?
I mean, formally, none, right? But I think there's a lot of overlap. So I came from a really religious background, and I left the Assembly of God Church and the evangelical Christian movement. And it was actually sort of like in this transition time that I got sick and then found naturopathy. And so there was a lot of, a lot that like was replaced for me in terms of rituals and things to do and how to think about the world. And I was sort of a little bit lost and looking for a worldview, and naturopathy certainly provided that. There's this idea, of course, that Mother Nature, you know, rules all, and that we have to respect Mother Nature, and you don't want to go against nature because then you can get sick, and if you hurt the earth, you're also hurting yourself. And so there's a lot of this sort of ideology, I would say, intertwined.
Fantastic. Britt, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming in on this weird time zone change from Germany. It's much appreciated. We have a limited number of people in the skeptical community who have come over from the other side, who have had that humility to say, this is wrong, we need to correct this, right? We have an even smaller number of people who are willing to stand up to lawsuits and take that all the way it needs to go. So your story is fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to say to all of you skeptics out there that if it wasn't for your support and your kindness and you're willing to listen to me, I would not have been able to do it. So we're not the grumpy, mean people that I thought you all were when I was a naturopathy student. You guys are kind-hearted, you're awesome, and just keep listening, keep doing what you're doing, and more people like me will come over.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And please stay tuned for more SkeptCal.